Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine walking down a bustling street in a major city, and as you look around, nearly half the population, like every other face you see on the sidewalk or in the markets or on the buses, is under the age of 14.
Right, it's a completely different visual.
It really is. And it's a demographic reality that completely rewires how a society functions, how it spends its money and how it plans for tomorrow. So today we are looking at a half century of data from the world's most heavily indebted nations to figure out if this explosive youth population is, well, a ticking economic time bomb, or maybe the absolute greatest economic engine of the 21st century.
I mean, it is the defining economic question of our era. We're looking at regions that are undergoing this massive, unprecedented transformation, and they're doing it under some of the most extreme fiscal pressures imaginable.
Exactly. And the reason we are doing this deep dive is because it is so easy to get caught up in the daily headlines, right? You see a news alert about global debt or poverty or, some geopolitical crisis, and it creates this very flat, one-dimensional narrative.
Yeah, it oversimplifies everything.
It totally does. But we have access to a truly staggering data set today. We are taking a magnifying glass to a comprehensive, multidimensional report that tracks the development trajectory of heavily indebted poor countries.
Which the financial world categorizes as HIPCs.
Right, HIPCs. And we are looking at a timeline stretching from 1970 all the way to 2023.
The scope of this source material is vital because it doesn't just look at a single metric, It's not just some spreadsheet of gross domestic product.
Which is what you usually get.
Exactly. This is a complete societal autopsy and physical. It cross-references macroeconomic data with social capital, physical infrastructure, and environmental constraints.
So it's everything.
Everything. We're analyzing everything from the granular International Monetary Fund and World Bank figures surrounding historic debt relief initiatives, right down to very localized youth literacy rates, agricultural water usage, and neonatal health statistics.
And if you are wondering how decades-old debt data from countries thousands of miles away affects your world today, just consider this. These nations represent a massive, undeniable share of the future global workforce.
Yeah, they are the future consumer base.
They really are. You simply cannot understand the supply chains or the geopolitical alignments or the environmental trajectory of the 21st century without understanding what is happening underneath the hood of these specific nations. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
To understand the progress of any society, you have to start with the baseline of their economy. But you have to immediately cross-reference that with who actually lives there, right? I mean, looking at gross domestic product in a vacuum doesn't tell us anything about the human beings generating it.
Which is a really common trap in macroeconomic analysis. GDP without demographic context is, well, it's just a vanity metric.
A vanity metric, I like that.
To understand the structural reality of these heavily indebted nations, we have to look at the tension between the wealth they are generating and the sheer number of people they are trying to support.
So let's get into the baseline numbers from the report. We are looking at GDP per capita, calculated in constant 2015 prices.
Which is important because it strips out the noise of inflation, giving us a true historical comparison.
Right, it keeps it apples to apples. So back in the 1970s, that number hovered around $737. By the year 2021, it had grown, fluctuating up to roughly $12,216.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the broader economic engine, the overall GDP growth rate for these nations often looks incredibly strong. We are talking about periods where it hovers between 4% and 6% annually.
Which is massive.
It is. I mean, in Western Europe or North America, a sustained 6% growth rate would be considered an absolute economic miracle.
It paints a picture of a roaring tiger economy, right? A 6% expansion means new factories, expanding agricultural output, and a rapidly growing domestic market.
But the data provides a massive caveat to that narrative. While the overall economic pie is growing at 4 to 6%, the per capita output growth, meaning the actual wealth distributed per person, is stubbornly stuck at a very low 2%.
And sometimes even lower than that.
Right. It's an incredible disconnect. It's like running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up. So if the overall economy is expanding that rapidly at 6%, why does the individual wealth, the per capita output, feel like it is barely crawling forward?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the mechanism driving that disconnect has very little to do with traditional economic inefficiency.
Like bad monetary policy or something.
Exactly, or stagnant industries. It has everything to do with demographic gravity. That low per capita growth is tethered to a historically unprecedented population boom.
All right.
It's a simple mathematical reality. You cannot distribute wealth effectively if the denominator in your equation, the population, is exploding at a rate that constantly dilutes your economic gains.
So the wealth is being generated, but the pie is being sliced into millions of more pieces every single year.
Exactly. The report details a phenomenon known as the youth bulge. In these HIPC nations, the demographic structure is heavily skewed toward children.
The people you see on the street.
Right. Specifically, children aged 0 to 14 have historically made up over 40% of the entire population. The data shows this peaked around 45.9% in the 1990s.
Wow, almost half.
Yeah, and it has dropped only slightly to 41.5% as of 2022.
Which brings us back to that image of walking down the street. Over 40% of the entire country under the age of 14.
And the economic consequence of that demographic structure is an astronomically high dependency ratio.
Okay, break that concept down for us. What exactly does a dependency ratio measure in the real world?
So the dependency ratio measures the number of dependents, which typically means children under 15 and the elderly over 64 for every 100 working-age people.
Okay, that makes sense.
In a mature, developed economy, you might have a ratio of 40 or 50 dependents per 100 workers. The workers generate enough tax revenue and personal savings to comfortably support the young and the old.
Because there's enough surplus.
Right. But in these nations, the total dependency ratio is astronomically high. The working-age population is under immense, crushing pressure.
Because every dollar of that 4 to 6% overall GDP growth is spoken for the second it's generated.
Precisely. It isn't going into long-term savings. It isn't being used as capital investment to build a new manufacturing plant or start a tech firm.
It's just survival mode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is being instantly metabolized by the society to provide the absolute basic necessities of survival: food, basic clothing, and foundational care for hundreds of millions of children. The wealth cannot compound because it is immediately consumed.
So it's this huge structural burden. But I know economists often look at this youth bulge and see a massive opportunity. How does a society transition that immense burden into an asset?
Through a mechanism called the demographic dividend. This is the exact same demographic pathway that fueled the explosive economic rise of East Asia in the late 20th century. It relies on a very specific sequence of events. If these young people can be adequately educated, if public health interventions keep them healthy, and if the global and domestic economy creates enough jobs for them as they age into their 20s and 30s.
Then the dependency ratio flips.
Exactly. It flips.
Because suddenly that massive block of children becomes a massive block of workers.
And because birth rates tend to fall as societies educate their citizens, those new workers will have fewer children of their own to support.
Oh, right. So the burden shrinks while the workforce explodes.
Exactly. So you suddenly have a massive, energetic, highly productive workforce with relatively few dependents. They generate a massive surplus of wealth, which drives industrialization and deepens the domestic consumer market. They become the hyper-engine of a booming economy.
But that relies on a massive if.
The biggest if in global economics. If the state fails to educate that 41.5% of the population and fails to foster an environment where jobs are created, that youth bulge remains a structural vulnerability.
So it goes the other way.
Right. Instead of demographic dividend, you get mass youth unemployment, severe social unrest, and long-term economic stagnation. It is a very precarious tipping point.
Which leads us directly into a massive logistical wall. Because if a government is presiding over a country where 40% of the citizens are children, how do they actually afford to build the infrastructure required to capture that demographic dividend?
Yeah, that's the multi-billion-dollar question.
I mean, you need thousands of schools, hospitals, roads, and electrical grids. The domestic tax base of a very poor country certainly isn't big enough to fund that level of capital expenditure.
They cannot fund it internally.
Right.
Historically, the only mechanism available to bridge that massive demographic valley was sovereign borrowing.
Right.
They had to take on foreign debt to build a state apparatus, which is literally the defining characteristic of the group we are analyzing, heavily indebted poor countries.
And the borrowing makes sense on paper, right? You borrow to build the school, the child gets educated, the child gets a high-paying job, and their taxes pay off the debt.
In theory, yes.
But looking at the data, especially around the 1990s, that strategy spiraled into a catastrophic trap. The economic vulnerability became so severe that some metrics of per capita wealth actually plummeted.
The 1990s represent a deeply dark nadir for these economies. The debt accumulated from the 1970s and 1980s, which was often taken out during periods of higher commodity prices, suddenly became unserviceable when global economic conditions shifted.
I was looking at the debt service figures in the report. This is the cash required simply to pay off the interest and the principal on the loans, not even to buy new
Right,
things.
just to tread water.
Exactly. And in the late 1990s, that debt service consumed up to 15.2% of all exports of goods, services, and primary income.
To contextualize that, imagine an entire nation's economy. Every single dollar they earn from interacting with the global market selling coffee, exporting minerals, providing services, 15 cents of every one of those dollars is immediately confiscated by international creditors just to cover past borrowing.
It completely squeezes out any possibility of domestic investment. If 15% of your national income is vanishing out the door, you are not building a new hospital ward.
Definitely not.
You are definitely not training new teachers to handle the youth bulge. You are barely keeping the lights on. And in response to this near-total fiscal collapse, the official data shows a massive intervention.
Yeah.
Official development assistance, what we generally call foreign aid or ODA, skyrockets. The data shows ODA flowing into these countries jumping from a scale of about $1 billion in the 1960s to a staggering $54.29 billion by the year 2022.
That influx of capital is deeply intertwined with the historic 1996 HIPC initiative. You cannot discuss the trajectory of these nations without understanding that specific policy intervention by the IMF and the World Bank.
So what was the goal there?
It was a globally coordinated effort to stop the bleeding, recognizing that these nations were trapped in a cycle where they were borrowing money just to pay the interest on old money.
How did that initiative actually function? Did they just wipe the slate clean overnight?
It was far more complex than a simple debt jubilee. The HIPC initiative ultimately provided around $76 billion in debt service relief.
Wow, $76 billion.
Yeah. But to quantify for that relief, countries had to commit to stringent macroeconomic reforms and poverty reduction strategies, often referred to as structural adjustment programs.
Strings attached.
Heavy strings. They had to prove they were opening their markets, stabilizing their inflation, and directing the freed-up capital toward health and education.
So it was $76 billion wiped off the ledger, or restructured, but with heavy conditions attached.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, when you combine the relief of that $76 billion with the massive ongoing influx of official development assistance from major donor nations.
Like the United States, Germany, the UK, France.
Exactly. It provided an absolutely crucial lifeline. It pulled these economies back from the brink of total institutional failure. But it introduces a profound structural fragility.
I have to push back on this narrative of success, though. When I look at these numbers, $54 billion a year in foreign aid, $76 billion in debt wiped away, it looks like we are looking at a synthetic economy.
How do you mean?
Well, if a country's hospitals and schools are being kept open by annual checks from Paris, Washington, and London, isn't that just a permanent state of dependency? Does this constant influx of ODA essentially act as a band-aid that removes the necessary pressure for these governments to develop their own robust, self-sustaining tax bases and industries?
It is the most heavily debated topic in development economics. Does aid foster dependency, or does it provide the necessary floor for growth?
Right.
If we look strictly at the mechanisms revealed in the data, the answer is complex. In the immediate context of the 1990s, that ODA wasn't a band-aid, it was a ventilator.
A ventilator. Wow.
Without it, state apparatuses in many of these nations would have simply collapsed. The data strongly suggests that child mortality would have spiked far higher, and basic governance would have disintegrated. The aid was an absolute biological and institutional necessity for survival.
Because you can't build a self-sustaining export industry if your population is starving and your government treasury is entirely empty.
Exactly. Survival is step one. However, the data also validates the long-term risks you're pointing out. While the ODA stabilized these nations, it hasn't miraculously birthed massive self-sustaining industrial bases across the board.
But the vulnerability is still there.
Yes. The fundamental gap between the aid flowing in and the domestic revenue being generated remains incredibly dangerous. The ODA bought them time. The structural challenge of the next 50 years is using that borrowed time to replace foreign assistance with sovereign economic engines.
So if they bought themselves time with $54 billion a year in aid and $76 billion in debt relief, the absolute most critical question is, well, where did all that money go?
Yeah, did it actually work?
Right. Did it actually change the structural reality on the ground, or was it absorbed by bureaucracy? To answer that, we have to step away from the macroeconomic spreadsheets and look at human capital. We need to look at the classrooms and the clinics, and the data here is genuinely remarkable.
The human outcomes are arguably the brightest spot in the entire half-century report. They demonstrate massive structural breakthroughs.
Let's run the educational numbers. Adult literacy, which is the absolute baseline requirement for participating in any modern industrialized economy, jumped from a dismal 43.6% in the 1990s to 66.6% in 2022.
Which is a huge leap.
It is. That is hundreds of millions of human beings gaining the ability to read and write. But what's even more impressive is the youth demographic. For people aged 15 to 24, literacy hit 75.8% by 2022.
And we have to look closely at the internal dynamics of that 75.8%, specifically the gender breakdown, because it reveals a revolutionary shift in societal structure.
I was actually looking at the Gender Parity Index for youth literacy in the report. This measures the ratio of literate females to literate males. In the 1990s, the index was sitting at 0.74,
Right.
meaning for every 100 literate boys, there were only 74 literate girls.
A massive structural inequality that literally locks half the population out of the economic engine.
But by 2022, that ratio improved dramatically to 0.94, nearly 1-to-1. That is a colossal leap in educational equality within a single generation.
The societal ripple effects of achieving a 0.94 gender parity index in youth literacy are profound. Development data consistently shows that educating young women is the highest leverage investment a society can make.
Because of how it changes family dynamics?
Exactly. The
Yeah.
mechanisms are clear. When women achieve literacy, infant mortality drops because they could read medical instructions and access better care.
That makes a lot of sense.
Family planning improves, leading to more sustainable birth rates. And crucially, female labor force participation rises, which instantly expands the productive capacity of the entire economy.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, I found a glaring contradiction in the physical data of these school systems.
Okay, what did you see?
We see these amazing outputs, 75.8% youth literacy, incredible leaps in gender parity. But then I look at the structural inputs, the actual plumbing of the education system.
The classrooms.
Right. The data shows that the primary school pupil-to-teacher ratio is stuck around 40-to-1, and the report notes it has been even higher in certain years and localized areas. How on earth is a system with 40 or 50 kids packed into a room with a single teacher producing a 75% literacy rate?
It looks like an impossible paradox on paper, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It's like trying to run a masterclass in a crowded subway car.
totally.
But the data reveals two very different realities coexisting within the same educational space. The system is operating in a state of what we might call high-quality, low-cost miracles at the absolute baseline, juxtaposed with high-stress, low-output failures in the deeper metrics.
Let's break those two realities down. How do you get a low-cost miracle with 40 kids to one teacher?
By focusing intensely on basic literacy. The global definition of basic literacy is generally the ability to read and write short, simple statements about everyday life.
Okay.
It turns out human beings are incredibly resilient learners. With intense community focus, basic rote learning methods, and mass enrollment campaigns, many of which were directly funded by that ODA we discussed, you can achieve basic literacy even in heavily crowded classrooms.
So they just drill it into them.
Essentially, yes. They have successfully democratized the absolute basics of reading and writing. They brute forced literacy into existence.
Okay, so that explains the 75% youth literacy rate. But what is the high-stress, low-output failure?
The failure occurs the moment you move past rote memorization. The deeper educational pipeline requires teaching critical thinking, advanced mathematics, sciences, and vocational skills.
Right, the stuff you need for a modern economy.
These are the inputs required for true industrialization. And that is where the 40-to-1 ratio becomes a hard, impenetrable ceiling. The pipeline data shows this clearly. While basic literacy is soaring, the primary school completion rate, the percentage of kids actually finishing those foundational years, sits at just 68.4%.
Wait, so a huge chunk of those kids who learn to read end up dropping out before even finishing primary school.
Yes. And if you look at secondary school, the gross enrollment rate is only about 35%.
Wow.
The educational pipeline is severely bottlenecked by a lack of physical infrastructure. There simply aren't enough secondary school buildings. And a critical lack of highly trained educators. You can teach the alphabet to 50 kids sitting under a tree.
Yeah.
You cannot teach chemistry or advanced algebra or software engineering to 50 kids without laboratories, textbooks, and an educator with an advanced degree.
I've heard economists use the term middle income trap when talking about this exact scenario. What does that actually mean in this context?
The middle income trap is a deeply frustrating mechanism in development. A very poor country can grow rapidly by utilizing its massive pool of cheap, unskilled labor to do basic manufacturing or agriculture.
Okay, getting them on the first rung of the ladder.
Right, that lifts them to middle income status. But to grow beyond that, to become a wealthy nation, they have to transition to high-value, high-skill industries like advanced manufacturing, technology, or complex services.
Which requires that advanced education.
Exactly. If a country's educational pipeline is bottlenecked, if they only have 35% of their youth in high school, they lose their cheap labor advantage as wages slowly rise. But they don't have the skilled human capital to compete with advanced economies, they get trapped in the middle.
So they have the software, the human capital, partially formed, but it's stalling before it can reach the level required to modernize the economy.
Precisely.
But education is only one half of the human capital equation. You cannot utilize a literate workforce if that workforce isn't surviving into a healthy adulthood.
The health data is critical here.
And this brings us to the health data, where the statistics look almost miraculous. I had to double-check this number when I read the report.
The health metrics are the most vital indicators of state capacity.
Life expectancy at birth in these heavily indebted poor countries surged from 40.8 years in 1960 to 64.7 years in 2022.
It's just incredible.
They literally added nearly 24 years of human life to their average citizen. 2.5 decades of existence conjured into reality by public health interventions.
It is arguably one of the greatest collective achievements of humanity in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
And the data shows a clear gender gap, which mirrors global biological trends, right? Female life expectancy is sitting at 67.1 years, outpacing male life expectancy at 62.3 years.
Yeah.
But the true driver of this massive leap in overall lifespan is found at the very beginning of life. Under 5 mortality plummeted from 108.9 deaths per thousand births in 1990 down to 62.5 per thousand in 2022.
A huge drop.
And neonatal mortality, which tracks infants dying within their first 28 days of life, dropped dramatically from 47.8 down to 25.4 per thousand. We're talking about millions of babies surviving early childhood diseases that would have claimed them just a generation ago.
But this raises an important question, especially when you look closely at the line graph tracking this life expectancy growth. It isn't a smooth, unbroken upward curve.
Oh, really?
There is a very noticeable, very tragic plateau in the data. Between 1990 and roughly 2005, the growth in life expectancy drastically slowed down, and in several specific nations within this group, it actually reversed.
Wait, reversed. What caused a 15-year stall in human lifespan in the middle of this broader health revolution?
If we synthesize the historical context with the data, that 15-year plateau maps perfectly onto the devastating peak of the HIV/AIDS epidemic across sub-Saharan Africa and other developing regions.
Oh, wow.
Just as the structural benefits of better sanitation, clean water, and basic childhood vaccines were pushing life expectancy up, a novel, deeply insidious virus tore through the adult population.
And from an economic standpoint, the timing and the target of that virus were catastrophic. It didn't just target the vulnerable elderly, it hollowed out the 25 to 40-year-old demographic.
Working age.
Exactly. It attacked the exact people who were supposed to be the economic engine. The parents, the teachers, the farmers.
The mechanism of economic damage was profound. When a farmer or a teacher falls ill, they stop producing. When they pass away, they leave behind orphans, which instantly spikes the dependency ratio we discussed earlier.
The burden goes up while the workforce goes down?
Exactly. It destroyed human capital faster than the education system could build it. But the data also shows a steep upward climb after 2005.
Oh, okay, good.
That rapid recovery reflects massive, historically unprecedented global public health interventions. The rollout of antiretroviral therapies, heavily funded by international initiatives, changed the landscape entirely.
So the aid really showed its value there.
Undeniably. And we see similar triumphs with other historic killers. The data shows malaria incidence dropped from 316 cases per thousand people in 2000 to 201 per thousand in 2022.
That's amazing. But I have to push back on this, though. We are looking at a system where infant mortality is dropping, HIV is being managed, and malaria is declining. But if this health resolution is being funded heavily by external initiatives and that $54 billion in aid, is it structurally sound?
That's the vulnerability again.
Right. And more importantly, we've beaten back the things that kill you quickly. But what about the actual quality of life for the people surviving? Are they thriving enough to build an economy, or are they just not dead?
That is the essential nuance. You are asking about the difference between mortality, whether someone dies, and morbidity, the state of being diseased or chronically unhealthy.
Right.
And the data provides a deeply sobering answer regarding morbidity. The report tracks the prevalence of anemia in women of reproductive age. And that number is shockingly high. It sits at 47.4%.
Wait, nearly half of all women of childbearing age in these nations are anemic?
Yes, and anemia isn't just a minor issue of feeling a bit tired. At a population level, it reveals a long-term, systemic, and deeply entrenched vulnerability in nutritional security.
Because it's an iron deficiency.
Exactly. Iron deficiency anemia means the blood lacks adequate healthy red blood cells to carry sufficient oxygen to the body's tissues.
So what does that actually look like for society?
Physiologically, it leads to profound lethargy, impaired cognitive function, and severe complications during pregnancy and childbirth.
That's awful.
From a macroeconomic perspective, it acts as an invisible anchor on human potential. If nearly half of your female workforce is physiologically exhausted because they simply don't have access to iron-rich foods or proper nutrient absorption, their productivity is drastically reduced.
They just don't have the physical energy.
Right. A rural farmer cannot work as many hours. A factory worker cannot maintain focus. Surviving childbirth and surviving childhood diseases is only step one. Ensuring proper, sustained, high-quality nutrition throughout a lifespan remains a massive, unresolved structural hurdle. You cannot build a high-functioning industrialized economy on the backs of a population that is chronically malnourished.
So we have a population of massive, booming youth. They are more literate than ever before, and they are surviving childhood at unprecedented rates, even if they're battling chronic nutritional issues.
Yeah.
But what kind of physical world are they stepping into when they walk out of their homes to start a business or look for a job?
Yeah, the physical reality.
This brings us to the infrastructure data.
The physical hardware of the state.
Exactly. And the absolute bedrock of modern infrastructure is electricity. The data shows that overall electricity access in these heavily indebted poor countries rose from around 17.8% in the late 1990s to 50.5% in 2022.
That's a huge jump.
It is. So half the population can now flip a switch and see the light come on. That is genuine measurable progress. But looking at the breakdown, that 50.5% average hides a massive gaping structural divide.
Averages often mask the deepest inequalities.
Urban electricity access is sitting at over 81.4%. If you live in a city, you likely have power. But rural access is lagging so far behind it feels like a different era. It has crawled from 7.2% up to just 31.8%.
Wow.
Nearly 70% of the rural population is still living without access to a power grid. That means cooking with biomass-burning wood or charcoal indoors, which has terrible respiratory consequences.
Right.
It means clinics cannot refrigerate basic medicines or vaccines. It means students cannot read after sunset.
It creates a completely bifurcated economy. The cities can plug into the global market, while the rural areas remain locked in subsistence models.
But then I look at the data on the digital economy, and it completely shatters the narrative of slow, agonizing infrastructure development.
Oh, the mobile data.
Yes. So what does this all mean? The growth curve for mobile technology in these nations looks like a hockey stick. Mobile phone subscriptions exploded from near absolute zero in the year 2000 to 6.4 billion subscriptions by 2022.
Billion with a B.
Yes. That equates to about 76.7 devices for every 100 people. And internet use went from 0.1% to 27.3%.
It is the ultimate example of technological leapfrogging.
Explain the mechanism of that leapfrog. Why did mobile phones scale so incredibly fast while the power grid is still crawling?
Because it proves a vital theory in development economics. Developing nations do not have to follow the exact linear, decades-long industrial path of Western nations.
Okay.
Think about how the telephone was adopted in the West. It required a century of centralized infrastructure. Companies had to chop down trees for telephone poles, string millions of miles of copper wire across every mountain and valley, and dig up city streets to connect every single house.
It was incredibly capital intensive.
Immensely so.
Yeah.
But these HIPT nations looked at that 20th century model and essentially bypassed it. They didn't wait to lay copper wire. Telecommunications companies could simply build a single cell tower on a hill and instantly cover a 30-mile radius.
They just skipped the landline phase entirely.
Exactly. They leaped directly into the 21st century. And the economic impact is transformative. A farmer in a remote village without a paved road can suddenly check global market prices for his crops via text message, entirely bypassing corrupt local middlemen.
That's a game changer.
They can use mobile money platforms to send cash to relatives without ever needing a physical bank branch. It upgrades the societal nervous system overnight.
It's a brilliant adaptation, but there is a massive, unyielding physical limit to that digital leapfrog, isn't there? I mean, you can bypass the copper wire, but you still have to deal with the reality of that 31.8% rural electricity rate.
Exactly. You cannot digitally leapfrog the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. While the digital world of SMS messages and internet data is weightless, it relies entirely on physical hardware. You cannot leapfrog the need for a physical electrical grid to actually charge the batteries inside those 6.4 billion mobile phones.
So what does that look like on the ground? How do you have 76 mobile phones per 100 people, but only 31% rural electricity?
It results in deeply inefficient workarounds. You have millions of people who own a smartphone, a device capable of accessing the sum total of human knowledge, but because their home has no power, they have to walk 3 miles to a market town and pay an entrepreneur running a highly polluting diesel generator just to charge their battery for the day. The technology is present, but it is tethered to a severe lack of foundational physical infrastructure.
A smartphone tethered to a diesel generator. That is such a vivid encapsulation of the paradox we are looking at. And it transitions us perfectly to the final and perhaps most existential constraint revealed in this half-century of data, the physical limits of the environment.
Right, the land itself.
Because while the digital world feels limitless, the geography of these nations is painfully finite. The massive population boom, that youth bulge we discussed at the very beginning, is now directly colliding with the ecology of the land itself.
This is where demography meets physical geography, and the numbers are incredibly stark.
Let's lay out the reality of the land. Due to the massive population increase over the last 50 years, the amount of arable land, meaning land that can actually be plowed and farmed to grow crops, has shrunk dramatically on a per capita basis.
Striking fast.
In 1960, there was 0.56 hectares of arable land for every single person. By 2021, that number had plummeted to a highly concerning 0.20 hectares per person.
To visualize the reality of 0.2 AP hectares, that is roughly half an acre. Imagine a plot of land about the size of 2 suburban backyards.
That's it.
That is the amount of soil available to grow enough food to feed a human being for an entire year, plus somehow generate a surplus to sell at market for income.
Why is it shrinking so fast? Is the land physically disappearing?
It's a combination of mechanisms. First, the simple math of the denominator increasing. Farms are being subdivided among children generation after generation. A father splits his farm among 5 sons, and suddenly the plots are too small to be commercially viable.
Right, the youth bulge in action.
Second, rapid urbanization is paving over fertile land surrounding cities. And third, overfarming without proper crop rotation or synthetic fertilizers is leading to severe soil degradation.
And it isn't just a crisis of soil, it's a crisis of water. The data shows that agriculture in these nations consumes a massive 90.6% of total water withdrawals.
90% of the water is being poured into the soil just to maintain basic food security.
And this brings us to the ultimate paradox of development. As these countries desperately try to industrialize to lift their booming youth populations out of poverty, they are forced to confront the environmental data.
The emissions.
Right. The report tracks greenhouse gas emissions. Total carbon dioxide equivalents actually dropped from 42.2 megatons in 1990 down to 29.9 megatons recently. But, and this is the critical detail, there is a rapidly rising contribution specifically from the energy sector, hitting about 35.0 megatons. Methane emissions, primarily from waste and energy production, are also climbing sharply.
If we synthesize all these points, we're looking at a looming, multifaceted crisis. It is a hard ecological ceiling approaching at high speed.
Yeah.
Let's connect the dots we've discussed today. The youth bulge, millions upon millions of children growing into adults, requires massive amounts of calories. They need food. Food requires arable land and fresh water. With land shrinking to just 0.20 hectares per person, and agriculture already eating 90% of the available water, traditional methods of farming are hitting an absolute physical limit. You cannot just clear more forest or divert more rivers indefinitely.
The soil is literally being outpaced by the birth rate.
Yes. Furthermore, as they try to solve the infrastructure problems we discussed, as they build the power plants needed to close that 31.8% rural electricity gap, to charge those cell phones and power new manufacturing centers, their energy-based emissions are rising.
It's a catch-22.
They are being forced to grapple with the environmental costs of their own survival. They are trying to industrialize and develop in an era where the atmosphere is already saturated with historical carbon emissions from the developed world. They are caught between the urgent, moral imperative to lift their citizens out of poverty and the physical constraints of a warming, resource-depleted planet.
It's an almost impossible tightrope. They are essentially being asked to do what the Western world did over the course of 150 years, but to do it in 30 years.
Exactly.
And to do it without burning cheap coal, and to do it with shrinking water tables, and to do it with half an acre of land per person.
It is the defining challenge of our era for the developing world.
Well, let's pull all of this together. We've spent this deep dive exploring a half-century of data tracking the structural realities of heavily indebted poor countries from 1970 to 2023. Let's synthesize the core takeaways from this massive autopsy.
First, we have to acknowledge the remarkable social progress. Despite immense fiscal headwinds, these nations added 24 years to the average life expectancy.
Which is incredible.
They achieved structural breakthroughs in basic literacy, bringing hundreds of millions of people, especially young women, into the world of reading and writing.
Second, the persistent economic vulnerability. We explored how the heavy burden of debt nearly crushed them in the 1990s, and how their immediate institutional survival remains heavily tethered to $54 billion in annual official development assistance. The engine is running, but it is deeply reliant on outside capital.
Third, the structural divide. The paradox of the data. We see 75% youth literacy, but primary school classrooms jammed with 40 students to one teacher, stalling the advanced human capital pipeline. We see 6.4 billion mobile phones, but a gaping hole in rural electricity, keeping nearly 70% of the countryside in the dark.
And fourth, the resource crunch. The ultimate unyielding physical test for the future. A booming youth population colliding with shrinking arable land, forcing a massive reckoning with water usage and energy emissions.
That's the landscape.
If you are listening to this and absorbing these numbers, you are looking at a group of nations that are transforming in the midst of extreme hardship. They are fighting tooth and nail for their economic independence while simultaneously trying to feed a booming youth population on shrinking land.
It isn't a simple flat story of triumph, nor is it a simple story of tragedy.
Right. It is a story of immense human resilience operating under extreme systemic constraints.
It is the ultimate balancing act of the 21st century.
Which brings me to a final concept, something for you to mull over after this deep dive ends. We explored how these nations brilliantly leapfrogged traditional telecom infrastructure. They bypassed the copper wires entirely and went straight to mobile phones and cell towers.
Right, the digital leapfrog.
The ultimate question for the next half-century, the question that will determine the fate of billions of people and the broader global economy, is this. Can these nations leapfrog traditional land and water-intensive agriculture with new ag tech?
Wow.
Can they implement massive-scale drip irrigation, drought-resistant seeds, and decentralized rural power grids before that youth bulge completely outgrows the soil beneath their feet?
Can their capacity to innovate outpace the demographic gravity?
Exactly. Let that percolate in your mind today. The diagnostic landscape of global economics is incredibly murky. It's complex. It looks like 40 kids in a classroom with a highly dedicated teacher, a smartphone in their pocket, a diesel generator humming outside, and a shrinking farm waiting at home. It is messy, but it is undeniably powerfully alive. Until next time, keep diving deep.